Okay, and we're back working on the Budget 302. Where we left off last time, we did a new baseline run on this and came up with about 254 horsepower and I think 285 foot-pounds of torque, and those are the uncorrected numbers. That was a bit lower than the previous run I did, which was around 274, I think. And a few things had changed between that test and this test. And when we looked at the corrected numbers between the previous test and this test, we were down to it was down about 13, I think, horsepower. So I had some time to think about maybe why that had happened. And I think part of it might have been to do with the smoother load control that I've got back here with the upgrades that I've made to the absorber and the control system for it. The other thing that's probably a bit of a long shot, and probably, I've got my doubts of whether or not this actually had much to do with it, but between the previous test and this test, I switched those stock hydraulic roller lifters from hydraulic to solid. When you do that, you end up with some valve lash in the valve train. When I adjusted those in, I gave it as little lash as I thought I could get away with, which was around I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think it was like 7 or 8 thousandths of valve lash, which isn't very much. But with that valve lash as compared to a hydraulic lifter, which basically has 0 valve lash, the more lash you have, the more duration and lift you're giving up. So could that have caused a little bit of the power loss? Maybe, but that's just an observation more than anything. And then the other thing was, and I forgot to mention it in the other video, but the other thing I changed between the previous video and this video was the oil change and that oil additive that I put in there, because when the engine was hot, I was running into low oil pressure issues. That's another change. And I noticed, well anyway, when I did the oil change and the additive, I put 5 quarts in there, which after looking at the stick at 5 quarts, that was considerably up on the stick, maybe that much different than before. So the oil level inside of the pan is probably maybe that much higher, possibly that much higher. So I must have been running before probably around 4 quarts in that oil pan. I've heard that that oil level can affect the windage in there and come up with some pretty bad can influence the drag on the rotating components inside the crankcase, but that, again, it's just a hypothesis, it's just a guess. And the other thing about that oil was it's quite a lot more viscous than the oil that was in it the previous time. We're not going to mess around with that right now. We're not going to mess around with changing anything else in this except for the one thing we're going to change this week, which is going to be the rocker arms. Hopefully they'll fit underneath these valve covers, that's a big if. So I wasn't actually planning on doing a video this week, but this other project I'm working on has me waiting for parts right now. And just in case anybody's interested what that other project is, we can go have a quick look at that now before I talk about the rest of what I want to do here. And anyway, the other thing I'm working on kind of came in unexpectedly. It found its way into my garage here. So, but anyway, it's a Subaru 2.5. Yeah, you guessed it. It needed head gaskets. But anyway, because I'm waiting for parts for this, I figure I might as well make some progress on this other thing. So let me go back and we'll talk about that some more, what I want to do with that. We're going to do a rocker arm change on here. So what should be in this in terms of rocker arm ratios are the stock stamped 1.6 ratio rockers. What I have to put in it is a set of the pedestal mount 1.7 roller rockers. One of the problems with doing it with those types of lifters or those types of rockers is that they're not adjustable like a stud mount rocker arm would be. So it means it's a lot of time setting the height of that rocker arm to get the valve lash right, because remember, we got solid lifters in there. But the other thing I want to do here is not just do a rocker arm install, because that's been done. It's been done a lot. But what I want to do is talk about a couple of things about what might help us getting a little extra power out of this engine by switching from the 1.6 to the 1.7. There's a couple of things in terms of the way it might affect the duration at the valve and the lift at the valve. We'll have a look at that, we'll have a talk about that, and then what I want to do is I kind of want to measure that a little bit. It's been a while, and probably only a handful of people have seen the video, but I made a attachment down here for the crankshaft so that I can mount a degree wheel onto that, so I don't have to take apart the front timing cover. I made an adapter so that I can do that. All right, so let's get moving along with this. Get the valve covers off, and at least this one, and we can have a look at what we want to do. And the other thing of it is that I'll go to the whiteboard here in a minute and kind of describe a little bit more about what I'm hoping is going to help this situation a little bit. So let's look at the whiteboard, kind of get an idea about that, and then we'll move on to some measurements. Okay, so here's one of my wonderful whiteboard diagrams. So talk about a little bit about what might happen when we change the rocker arm ratio on this engine. And you know, for the longest time I never thought about how it might affect the duration. It was pretty clear to me how it might affect the valve lift, but before I never really thought about how it could affect the duration. So with the valve lift, you know, I think we can kind of figure that out pretty easily. I mean, how, you know, a higher rocker arm ratio would change the valve lift. So because the rocker arm ratio is going to affect not only the peak valve lift, it's going to affect the valve lift everywhere through the curve. We'll look at the valve timing events at 50 thousandths valve lift. So because the rocker arm ratio is going to affect the valve lift everywhere, it means that the valves with the higher rocker arm ratio, it should reach 50 thousandths valve lift earlier. So because of that, it's going to effectively change the duration that the valve is open. So there's a lot more to it than that. I'm not going to get into rocker arm geometry and all that stuff. That's a whole thing. Now, since I've never done this before, I have no idea how much that's going to change. With the valve lift, you know, we can kind of roughly estimate what it might do. This has got the HO50 camshaft in it, so I can't remember exactly what my valve lift was, but it seems like these things are right around like 440 thousandths valve lift. So if you take that, divide it by 1.6, you get about like a 2.75 lobe lift. And then you take that lobe lift and multiply it by a 1.7 rocker, you get like 467 thousandths. So, you know, 28 thousandths maybe. Extra valve lift, extra peak valve lift is what we might be looking at there. So that's a quick way of looking at that, but what we're going to do next is we're actually going to measure these things. I'm going to do it with the 1.6 rocker, and then I'm going to measure that with the 1.7 rocker. And I might measure it at not just 50 thousandths valve lift, but I might measure it at 6 thousandths valve lift too. And then we can, I got the other whiteboard down here below, and we can write down all those pieces and have a look at it. Let me get the valve cover off of it. Let me get that degree wheel adapter and everything mounted in place, and we can start measuring these things and see what kind of a difference we're going to be looking at. I've got my dial indicator set up on there, so I'm probably going to measure it off of here. So we're going to be measuring the duration in terms of crankshaft angle at the valve. We'll be looking at valve lift. So, and the reason to make the valve lash the same from A to B is because valve lash can also affect the duration a little bit. So we want to make that as close as we can. And then the way I've got this set up so that I don't have to take the engine all apart again to do, you know, to get the degree wheel on it, is I made this thing with the printer. I think this was quite a while ago. It was like almost a year ago maybe. And it goes on there, and there's a socket inside of here, and this is hollow, and the extension comes through here, and get the ratchet on there. You can turn the crankshaft with that, and then the degree wheel mounts to the front of it. And I'm just gonna, it's not perfect, but I'll just keep that in mind. We're gonna just indicate off that mark on the front of the water pump. So there's a time saver there, being able to do this with the engine together. And let's get moving on. Now what I'll say is that I've done these measurements before with the light checker springs in and the hydraulic lifters in place. So I've done this before. I've measured this camshaft before doing it that way, and I measured them at the lifter and at the valve. So I did that both before, and maybe I can dig out that information and we can compare all three of these things maybe at some point. So yeah, that's what the plan is here. I'm not going to bore you with taking all these measurements, but I've got, what we'll do is we'll get them all recorded, get them on the whiteboard, and we'll kind of go from there. So let me get to work on this, and we can start getting things going. Okay, so I've kind of gone off on a bit of a tangent here. Anyway, something kind of unexpected happened here. The duration numbers I was getting were way lower than the duration numbers that I got back when I did this, when I checked these durations when I first installed the HO cam in here with the hydraulic lifters. I thought maybe some of that was because I was doing the durations with the service springs installed. So you can see I've gone back to the light checking springs in there. And that brought it up some. And then I was like, well, what else could be doing that? And I was like, well, maybe it's because of the valve lash here that we had, because we, you know, a hydraulic lifter basically follows the lobe pretty closely because it's got essentially zero lash. Now, when we switch to these, we have to run a certain amount of lash there because it's a solid lifter. But I was like, well, maybe that's part of the problem too. So far, I've checked it about 3 different ways. First, I checked the durations with the service springs in. Then I just switched over to the light checking springs, checked the durations that way. And now I checked it the third way, which is where I took all the shims out from underneath here that I used to set the valve lash with these stock rocker arms, because they're not adjustable. So I took those out, and so now basically it's the solid lifter, but it's got zero lash. So obviously you couldn't run the engine that way, because with this setup it's going to hang the valve open a little bit and it won't run, or if it does run, it's going to run very, very badly and it won't run for very long. 3 different ways I checked it, and it's kind of interesting what the results were, and I've got them all written down out here, so let's kind of have a look at that. So this is with the 1.6 rocker. This is the valve lashes that they were at to begin with before I changed anything today. Now, what I did before, I went and reviewed the video where I did the measured the duration at the valve after I installed the HO cam, and these are the durations that I got back then. So that was about, I don't know, what was that, been almost a year ago maybe? But these are the durations I measured then with the checker spring and the hydraulic lifter. So that's what that stands for: checker spring, the light checker spring, and the hydraulic lifter. And here you can see this is the checker spring with the solid lifter that I put in. And look at how much different the durations are. What is that, 22 degrees at 6 thousandths? And then you go down here and it's about 2 degrees at 50 at the valve. And then you kind of see something similar happening here, 219 versus 223. And then what I did here is this is what I measured the durations at with the checker spring and the shims taken out, so that it's at zero lash now. It looks like to me, between these two things, I'm guessing that this valve lash here is causing me to have a fairly significant loss in duration because of that valve lash, and that's a lot more than I would have expected. I may be losing quite a bit of performance by having switched to that solid lifter on there. Okay, so my decision to stop here and not install those roller rockers on this engine with these lifters, there's 2 reasons I'm doing that. The first one we already just talked about. When I do a change on an engine, I don't like to change 2 things at the same time. And so, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change 2 things at the same time, which I don't like to do. But we're going to change the lifters out. I'm going to get some just replacement hydraulic lifters in there. And then we'll put the rocker arms, those roller rocker arms on. And like I said, I don't like to change 2 things at the same time because you don't really know how each one affected it. But one of the reasons I'm not going to go through the test and put those roller rockers on here like this is because when you use a pedestal mount on a solid lifter, it takes a really long time to get them adjusted right so that the lash is right. And considering I think that these lifters in here are costing me power anyway, I don't see the sense in going through all that trouble shimming these up or having to remove material from the bottom of the post there to move it down in order to get the valve lash correct. I think that's a lot of work for not a lot of results. So that's where I'm going to end this video. Unfortunately, I wanted to get a lot further, but I wasn't expecting this business here to happen. Now the next thing that's happened is I have the parts that I need to go back to work on that Subaru, and I really need to get that done. So if I don't see you next week, I'll see you some other time.